joy to be here, first of all, and thank you, Mary Rose, for allowing me to be here. The reason I'm here, ultimately, is that Socrates in the City, which I'm happy to plug, is an event series that we've been doing in New York City for the last 11 years. It takes its name from, you guessed it, Socrates. Thank you. And the idea, New York is a famously secular place. I would say more secular than D.C., and I thought it would be appropriate to have conversations, speakers on the ultimate subjects, the big questions. For me, if you're honestly asking the big questions and open your heart and mind to the big questions and to truth, you'll find your way to Jesus Christ. This is just a bias that I bring to the table. So I really, we've been doing this for 11 years. We've had many speakers you would have heard of, some you wouldn't have heard of, but I assume that if you're here, you might have heard of George Weigel or Peter Kraft or Father Newhouse or Thomas Howard. In some ways my favorite. I don't know if you know the writings of Thomas Howard, but extraordinary writer and thinker, and many, many others that you'd be familiar with. And they opine on the big questions being what we like to call life, God, and other small topics. Anything that touches on the big questions. Who are we? What's the meaning of life? Are science and faith reconcilable? All those kinds of things. Sometimes it's a little bit more overtly Christian than at other times. We've 3 times in the course of 11 years had Jewish speakers. We're going to do an event in Fort Worth in May with Dennis Prager. So we're a little bit all over the map, but basically Catholic intellectuals and evangelical intellectuals. And if you're snickering quietly, please stop that. So that's what we do. We're launching Socrates here in D.C. tonight at the University Club, which is, I think, almost literally a stone's throw from here. We have a speaker, Stephen Meyer, who's going to be talking about the intelligent design movement, and we don't normally pick topics so controversial to start with, but in this case, he happened to be in town, and it happened to be possible. But I think anything that is hard to talk about, I think we try to talk about. The issues that you will not talk about in polite cocktail conversation in New York living rooms, those are the kinds of things that we pick to talk about, because I'm, as an American, offended by the idea that we can't discuss certain things, and I feel that there is a kind of proto-fascist, I'm being generous by saying proto, kind of bullying that happens in the culture, and that we need to be vocally and politely against that, and to talk about anything, including the subject of Darwinism and whatever it is. And so we really try to do that and try to have a civil environment in these conversations so that anyone can ask any question. It's not about putting forward a point of view. But anyway, that's what we do at Socrates in the City. And we finally, after 11 years, came out with a book published by Penguin Dutton called Socrates in the City, which has 11 of, I would call it, our most representative talks over the last 11 years. And some real treasures in there, I have to say. I'm glad that we kept that we recorded them all, because when I read them, went through these transcripts, I said these are just treasures. And to think that it was some evening in 2004 that 212 people got to hear, but the fact that we actually have it, so we put it in the book along with my typically silly introductions. My introductions are meant to be goofy enough to engage the groundlings who might have showed up, and to make it seem like talking about the big questions could be fun, which actually it could and ought to be fun if you know that there are good answers to the big questions, and that the big answer to the big question is not that life is meaningless and that's that. If you know that there's actually good news, you can sort of have some fun when you explore these things. So that's what we try to do. So the book just came out a few months ago, and I'm thrilled to recommend it, not for my introductions, which are in the book, but for the talks, which are truly spectacular. If you can imagine, we left out talks that are spectacular because we only could get 11 in there, but George Weigel's talk, which is amazing, on the cube in the cathedral, and a number of others that we could not get into the book, but we're planning a second volume. So that's why I'm here, and it has a lot to do with everything else that I would want to talk about anyway, so I don't feel like that's too much of a digression. To to talk about Bonhoeffer for a moment, and you can ask whatever questions you have, but to explain what Mary Rose was mentioning about President Obama, it's an interesting thing. I don't know if you're familiar with the National Prayer Breakfast, but I have been to two of them over the years. I went to the one in 97, which was 2 weeks after the Lewinsky scandal broke. And the thought that President Clinton would walk into a room with basically 3,500, conservative evangelicals it seemed, as impossible as anything in the physical realm. It just didn't seem that he could walk into that room. But, he's really not such a shy guy after all, and he was perfectly willing to walk into the room and pretend that nothing had ever happened. I didn't say lie, but to pretend that nothing happened. And it was one of the most bizarre moments in my life because you could hear the sound of 3,500 people applauding the office of the president only. It was very, very odd. It was a very strange thing, but there was enough graciousness in the room to applaud the office of the president. But so strange to be at that and then to be at the one in 2002 right after 9/11, where obviously George Bush spoke, and completely different. But that's my experience with the National Prayer Breakfast until I was invited to speak, and obviously the president always shows up, and it was an extraordinary thing for me to have the privilege of, in effect, saying whatever I liked in the presence of people with whom I would disagree politically, and to be able to say, to touch on the life issue and on the issue of biblical sexuality, but in a way which I hope showed the love of Jesus, because I really believe it's biblical that if we don't speak the truth in love, we are actually not speaking the truth. Truth is a person. It's not a fact or a series of facts, and that we have to represent that person as we're speaking truth. But I was able to touch on the life issue and to think that it might be possible somehow to have a deeper conversation on the life issue in America. I think the time has come for us to keep trying, but to try in a different way, and to see if we might find common ground with people. Getting finally to Bonhoeffer, I was in Colorado Springs recently, and I've been talking about Bonhoeffer wherever I go, and somebody told me that he was friends with Harry Reid, and that Harry Reid had read the Bonhoeffer book. And I came to, I guess it was 4 hours later. Yeah, that was also a joke. Thank you. And then I walked in the parking lot, and the same guy was out there, and he had a cell phone, and he said, "Yes, Senator. Yes, Senator. Hold on a second. I have the author of Bonhoeffer here." And he hands me the phone. Now, I don't care if it's Santa Claus on the other end. I despise when people hand me phones and say, "Talk to this person." But I did, and Senator Harry Reid, with whom I would say I disagree strongly on most political issues, very graciously told me over the phone how he'd read the book and given it to everyone he knew, and I couldn't believe it. I said, "This is real. I'm not making this up, or this is not wish fulfillment. This is really happening." And if you read the story of Bonhoeffer, you read that Bonhoeffer wrote that abortion is murder. And I have to say, this gave me hope. That if someone like Harry Reid is enthusiastically recommending this book where that is contained, I think there's hope. I think that there are many people who might vote in a pro-choice way who really know that this is wrong somehow, and that they're still clinging to this silly Cuomo idea that you can believe one thing and vote another way or whatever. They're somehow rationalizing this. But I have to believe that there is hope on this issue, and that folks like Harry Reid somehow might be able to be led a little bit closer to where we're coming out on this. Maybe that's naivete. It probably is naivete, but there may be some reality to it as well. To Bonhoeffer, I will simply say that I didn't want to be a biographer when I grew up, and I'd like to think that I'm still not a biographer, although I have written 2 biographies. The way they came about was that in my 24th year in life, I'd gone to Yale University, which you may know is slightly secular. And whatever faith I had growing up, I was raised in the Greek Orthodox Church. I lost at Yale because that's what they do with one's parents' money. And I graduated quite confused. And I had, in my 24th year, a real conversion experience, quite dramatic and now, from that point on, have called Jesus Lord and been an outspoken Christian. And at some point in my career, I wanted to be a writer. I wrote some books of Christian apologetics, really popular level, with the title, Everything I Always Want to Know About God, But We're Afraid to Ask, because I kept thinking of all the people that I knew, that I grew up with, who were lapsed or nominal Catholics, who were some kind of vague pseudo-Protestants, or who were just agnostics wandering through life. I thought, how do you engage those people? And those are the most of the people that I have known growing up. It's not about arguing somebody into the faith, because people they sort of have a vague idea that God exists. And if you look at the polls and things, it seems obvious that most people, I would say, are generally inclined to believe something, but they don't know where to look. They've got some friends that are really hardcore born-again nuts or hardcore Catholic nuts, and they don't want to talk to those people. Who do they talk to? Well, everything else seems to be secular, and I thought I'd like to write a book that's very kind of gingerly, cheerfully talking about the big questions from a very broadly ecumenical Nicene Creed kind of point of view. And so I did that, and that led to my being on CNN, being asked about this, and I expected some really difficult questions of theodicy or something, and instead I got a question about William Wilberforce, whom I had mentioned very briefly in the book. And so I found myself talking on CNN about Wilberforce, and if you watch CNN, you may notice that they don't often talk about Wilberforce or theodicy, but this led to being asked to write a biography of William Wilberforce. And Wilberforce is one of these heroes of the Christian faith who, because of his faith in Jesus, gave his life in politics to do the right thing and to stand against the slave trade and so much more, which I cover in the book. It's hard to believe what this man accomplished. It's almost unbelievable, except it's true. And then everyone asked me who I'd like to write about next. And I didn't really want to write another biography, but to make the long story a little shorter, I thought Bonhoeffer for a number of reasons, because my mom is German, grew up in Germany during this period, and I really was so amazed that a man, because of his Christian faith, would stand against the Nazis in this way, die in a concentration camp, that we wouldn't know this story. It just seemed to me scandalous, and there's something about his story which I thought needed to be told. Little did I know that I would write such a big book. Little did I know it would do so well. I can say bluntly that I'm not used to success. I'm used to working hard and praying and hoping that someday the Lord would open a door. To have that door opened is a shock, which it shouldn't be if you have real faith, but I think sometimes we have to admit that we don't have as much faith as we thought we did. And so the success of the book has amazed me. I had the privilege of getting a handwritten note from George W. Bush, who'd loved the book. And then when I was asked to speak at the prayer breakfast, I jokingly said that George W. Bush had read it, and as we all know and we've all read, he's intellectually incurious. So, and I looked over at the president and I said, "No pressure." And then if that wasn't enough, I handed him a copy ostentatiously of the book, and again said, "No pressure." And then handed him a copy of the Wilberforce book and said, "No pressure. I know you have time to read on plane ride, so here you go." And just made a joke of it. But he said he would read it, and of course I hope he will. If only to see that wonderful people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer could believe that abortion is in fact taking of a human life. As I say, I've been amazed by the reception of the book. I think the reason, in part, is that, and I hear this so much that I can hardly believe it, but I know that it's true, that there's something about the story of Bonhoeffer which reminds most readers of what we're living through today. Now, when I set out to write the book, I went into it the way I wrote Wilberforce, totally ignorant. I just thought, well, it's just an interesting story. I know the basics, and I can tell the story. Hopefully I can tell it well to engage others and to educate others about this great life. And in the course of doing so, I discovered things that surprised me. It surprised me to discover anything that surprised me. I thought that, the basics are the basics, but there was a lot. And one of the things about Bonhoeffer is that he was not theologically liberal, as I had been led to believe, or at the end of his life become some kind of agnostic, some kind of humanist. That's simply not true, and I was shocked to find out that it's absolutely clearly not true, that he stays a very faithful Christian to the end. And that this idea of religionless Christianity, in fact, Tom Howard, whom I mentioned earlier, I remember when I mentioned I'm writing a book about Bonhoeffer, he said, that's the guy who put forward this idea of religionless Christianity. And I said, well, Yeah, except he meant precisely the opposite of what everyone thinks he meant by that. He means robust, actual Christianity as opposed to dead religion, where people just go through the motions and don't really believe it or live it, like that 98% that uses contraception. So I was also surprised, finally, by what I discovered in terms of the parallels. As I was writing this, I thought, this sounds so strangely familiar, and there are parallels to today. And I went out of my way not to underscore the parallels in the book, because I just wanted it to be a work of biography, but I thought, this is extraordinary that I'm writing something that is about a time and a place that's so different from where we are, and yet the more I write about it, the more I'm struck by the parallels. And you can overdraw the parallels, and you should not. At the same time, not to see them is hard to do. I was, in fact, this HHS mandate, which I've spoken about publicly on MSNBC and so on and so forth. Now, I'm a Protestant evangelical. I'm not a Catholic, but this is one of these cases where I think if every American doesn't see this as a threat to America, if every Protestant doesn't see this as a threat to believers in Jesus Christ, we are dead. This is not a Catholic issue. This is an American issue. It's an issue of religious liberty. Without religious liberty, we're dead. There is no America without religious liberty. And if we who believe in this can be marginalized, again, there's no America. The whole idea of America, as far as I see it, has to do with the idea is that we protect minorities even if we disagree with them. So it makes no difference what your position is on contraception. It makes no difference what your position is on the Catholic Church. It makes no difference. If you're an American, you understand this is an issue of principle. And I have to say that in the course of thinking this through, I said this is so oddly similar to where Bonhoeffer found himself in his in the beginnings of the National Socialist movement, where he's trying to wake up the church to say, you don't understand, we've got to all speak up now over this. If we don't fight now, if we don't really use all our bullets now, we will have no fight 5 years from now. It'll be over. This is it. We've got to die on this hill. And most people at the time said, "Oh no, this isn't serious enough. You know, it's just this little issue." But it's the millimeter which is really, it's that line that we cross. It's not just a millimeter. So anyway, I'm just amazed by some of these things, and I'm sorry to say that I see these parallels. I really wish I didn't, but it's kind of interesting. I think it's the reason that the book has done so well, because I think a lot of Americans have read it and said, wow, this is a warning for us. And I see Bonhoeffer's voice as a prophetic voice. I see him as someone who, like Isaiah or Jeremiah, was saying things to call the people of God to be the people of God. And we know it's always a struggle for the people of God to actually be the people of God. And that in his day, clearly, his voice was not heeded, and his voice, if it's prophetic, is really the voice of God. It's not Bonhoeffer's voice. But I think that somehow we might today be getting a second chance, just as we can today say, wasn't Isaiah a great guy? And take what he says seriously. I hope that the story of Bonhoeffer can wake up the church today so that we don't make the same mistakes and go down the same road. I don't think we need to, but I think we can and we will if we don't repent and wake up. Pick your metaphor. So I didn't mean to go on so long. I never do. So let me just open it up to a couple of questions in the time we have, and then we can sign some books.
Bonhoeffer was, I guess, executed in Nazi Germany in the concentration camp.
True. I prefer true or false questions. True. Yes. In 1945, April 9th, 1945. Yeah, forgive me for not making that clear. Sometimes I just... Bonhoeffer was a member of a prominent German family. He became a theologian, was an amazing theologian, but then decided he wanted to, after a trip to New York, he really, somehow his heart was changed so that he wasn't just an intellectual Christian, but he became a serious disciple of Jesus Christ. And when he came back to Germany, he... immediately found himself opposing the Nazis who were rising. And this is his story. It's this kind of evolving resistance. It kept changing, I think, as he felt the Lord leading him differently, until finally, in 1939, when the war came, he knew that he couldn't fight in the war, not because he's a typical pacifist, but because he knew this was a war of aggression and that it was a war of, nationalism, run amok, and he couldn't fight in the war. So what was he going to do? Well, first he tries to escape again to America, but then he realizes the Lord's calling him to go back. And he then officially joins the conspiracy against Adolf Hitler, joins this resistance which was centered in German military intelligence, where there were a number of the leaders, one of them was his brother-in-law who hired him, who were conspiring to assassinate Hitler and the top members of the party to end this horror. He was imprisoned for his involvement in getting 7 Jews out of Germany, not for his involvement in the conspiracy, but then while he was in prison already, the conspiracy was uncovered in July of 1944 when the Valkyrie plot failed, and he was executed on April 9th, 1945. I saw a hand. Thank you.
I have an easy question and a hard one. The hard one is, do you think that because he was part of an organization that was trying to assassinate Hitler, that would undermine somehow his witness as a Christian?
You mean like it undermined David when he killed Goliath? Now I'm going to stop you there. You're not going to dodge it. No. Do we celebrate David? Do we celebrate David? Did he ever repent of having killed Goliath? Is David not a Catholic saint? I keep hearing of these Saint Davids. Okay, so, but no, and of course it's a deep question. I'm just being silly, but I think what's that? Where do I go to church in New York? I go to an evangelical Episcopal church, but I do not define myself really as Episcopalian, but I do go to an evangelical Episcopal church, which is what? Calvary St. George's. But I often go to Redeemer, Tim Keller Presbyterian Church, and to Times Square Church, David Wilkerson's church. So, but on the question of that, I think this is, to me, it's the lonely path of the true disciple of Jesus Christ is knowing that you ultimately are answering to the Lord, and that if you hope you're getting it right, but the question is, what is the Lord asking you to do, and not what people think of it? And I think it gets very lonely. I think Bonhoeffer really did feel that most people wouldn't understand what he was doing. He felt that he must do this, but he wouldn't cavalierly say that this is the answer and everyone has to agree with me. He was very humble about it, and he really felt that even if I'm doing something that is wrong, I then cast myself on the mercy of Jesus Christ, because I can't pretend that I'm 100% sure about this, but at the same time, he felt that he must act, that to sort of take this sort of cheap, easy religious answer and to say, oh, I can't do that. So he felt, no, I've got to do it. And I think that often it's our temptation to take the religious pejorative answer and to say, okay, thou shalt not lie. So if the Gestapo knocks on my door, I don't have to say, no, there's not a Jew in the basement. I can lie. I mean, I can tell the truth and be justified before God. But I think that Jesus and the prophets always call us to look deeper and to say, what is really a lie and what is really the truth. Be careful. Don't be cavalier. Don't be religious about it and have this, well, I'm going to tell the truth or I'm not going to kill what you have to think more deeply. Bonhoeffer, his story forces us to think more deeply about these questions, just obviously as Jesus did when Jesus said, you've heard it said X. Well, I say unto you, forcing us to think more deeply about what is God saying, what will bless God, as opposed to, the sort of the slogan or the idea that we think is right. God always challenges us, and I think Bonhoeffer does the same. He really does challenge us to think more deeply about these questions. And if you knew that millions of Jews are being murdered, you can't really be, you're not just an armchair theologian thinking about it. You've got to think, what do I do? I mean, if people are being killed in the other room now, what do we do? What do we do? You're forced to deal with this. And I think that's how Bonhoeffer felt. He knew what was happening. Most Germans did not. Honestly, they didn't. But he did. So it's complicated. It's not an easy thing. Yes.
But in your book, they also said that they had passed words to the Allied that there was massacres going on, and nobody did anything.
Well, yeah. I mean, I won't claim to know too much more about that than you probably do.
Well, and then it went through also the church in Spain and in Rome, And now the church, Catholic Church, having tried to also did a lot of things to try, because I think I remember that the first article that appeared in New York against the Nazi was one of the articles that was written by the seat of the Vatican, I think in 1940, something like that, where it was openly said that they were against because there was, there was. And what I feel a little bit annoyed is that after that, now everybody is telling the church has been accomplice to the Nazi, when it has, in fact, made people aware of it, and nobody did something about it.
Well, again, this is really complicated. I do think that people have, sort of this cheap idea that, especially that the Catholic Church didn't do anything and that they were something. I think it's ridiculous to state it that way. Who's to say? That is very complicated. I do know that the German Lutheran Church was, on the one hand silent, and on the other hand, 6,000 German pastors in 1934 signed the Barmen Declaration and publicly came out against the Nazified Reichskirche, state church. So to pretend that everybody rolled over it, that's not true. It's clearly not true. And, you get the basics of that in my book, but there's so much more to the story. And so many Christians, serious Christians, were persecuted by the Nazis. It's clear that the Nazis, and I make this very clear in the book, that the Nazis were bitterly anti-Christian. They were brilliant enough not to declare themselves against the church because they don't want to lose political power, but it's very clear that they were not actual Christians, but they were, in fact, bitterly anti-Christian. But if you were a mere churchgoer, neither they nor Satan has much difficulty with you. In fact, probably likes you very much because you're helping. But if you're serious about your faith, Niemöller was imprisoned by Hitler for 8 years, and any of the others who spoke out. So, yeah, it's quite a story. Yes, sir.
In your research, in looking through things, I mean, what was it? Did Bonhoeffer ever directly write down his thought process from a theological standpoint that justified his action? I know it was a transformation over a period of time.
Yeah, no, he couldn't do that. I mean, he didn't do that really, in part because he couldn't do that. He couldn't put in writing what might be discovered and held against him and his family and so on and so forth. But everything I know about that I pretty much put in the book. It's complicated, but we do have a lot of anecdotal. People would tell stories about, conversations they had with Bonhoeffer about this issue, which gives us some color and some nuance to his thinking on it. Yes, ma'am.
I have a follow-up. So because you started this saying, he says abortion is murder and that it's, justifiable in your view in a David Goliath scenario. Do you believe it's justifiable in every case then to just shoot abortion doctors?
Oh, I've shot many, but I can't tell you about that publicly. No, the answer to that is emphatically no. And whenever people make that leap, I'm amazed at the leap. You're leaping very, very far. Well, let me finish. Bonhoeffer. I won't try to unpack this now because we don't have the time, and it's it really requires a long time. But the short version is that Bonhoeffer was not sloppily advocating violence. He wasn't saying an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This is a much more complicated thing. You have a head of state overseeing monstrosities and horrors, that it wasn't just part of what was happening under him, but he was the person,
Right, like Cheney in Iraq, basically.
Pardon me?
Like Cheney in Iraq.
Like what?
Cheney in Iraq, or Bush in Iraq.
Like Bush in Iraq.
Yeah. Orchestrating massive slaughter of millions of Iraqis for protection of fraudulent reasons. So we should just try to assassinate him, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's the nonviolence of Jesus that speaks against, naming that as being virtuous in every case.
Well, this honestly it's a deep theological question, and I think it's clear when you're familiar with the story of Bonhoeffer that he was not advocating violence in the way that I think some have suggested, and that he would really very seriously take issue with that. And I think to make the leap to killing abortion doctors or to killing heads of state, it's a far cry. I mean, I think it's hard for us to understand what it would have been like to live in the Third Reich. In other words, I think that in some ways we can kind of relate it to where we are today, but things had gone on so far and they had seen such extraordinary horrors over such a long period of time, it sort of puts you in a different place. Bonhoeffer was not advocating this kind of thing, for example, in 33 or 35 or 37. It took a long time for him to get to that place and for him to feel comfortable with it. He could see him sort of nibbling around the edges of this for years, trying to puzzle it out in his own mind. It took him a long time before he actually felt that he could enter the conspiracy officially. So, anyway, we may have to have just one more question, I think.
Not a question. It's, after reading your book, come to the conclusions that, it's like you said, if you do not take advantage of you don't see at the very beginning where you can basically fight it with non-violent means by opposing legally or by making yourself vocal, sooner or later, if you don't win that battle because you don't fight it hard enough, you will have to take arms. Unfortunately.
Well, Bonhoeffer needs to be said too. He was very interested.
It's not the thing, but it is. You're going to have to do that. You're going to have to resist. And when people come at you with, killing or whatever, I'm talking about this because I come from the part of France where there was a lot of resistance in the east of France, and whether you want it, we were just on the demarcation line, So whether you wanted to be or not, you were involved by this, because it involves your neighbor, it involves. Yeah. And you cannot stay.
Well, Eberhard Bethge, who really wrote the great masterwork, the 1,100-page reference work on Bonhoeffer, who it seems to me was politically liberal. He would get offended when people would say to him, "Well, how could you be involved in the plot to kill Hitler?" Because I think because he had lived through this. He said, "I don't think you understand." In other words, he would say that you don't. We're now living in a time so different from that, and I think that it's hard. It was hard for him to deal with that because he felt that at some point we must stand up. But you have to be very prayerful and humble about how and when you do it. So whenever people make the leap today to say that, well, should I assassinate somebody I disagree with, or should I assassinate an abortion doctor, or something like that, the short answer is absolutely not. And you haven't thought very deeply about this if you're already making that leap, which, again, some people are only too happy to do. Bonhoeffer was as far from that kind of a person, I think, as there is. So why don't we stop there? If you're still interested in these books, I'll sign them. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all of you for coming as well. And in addition to plug this newer book that's also available out there, Socrates in the City, that Eric was mentioning. And as someone who lived both in Washington and New York, I can say Washington offers a lot of intellectual events and religion in public square as well. But when I was in New York, it was hard to find really good speakers of intellectual weight, speaking on religion. And it was really Eric Metaxas' Socrates in the Cities program that brought that to New York. That was really excellent, heavyweight speakers. And you really don't want to miss reading what they had to say and keeping your eye out for the second volume as well. In addition, the good news is Socrates in the City has come to D.C., and so starting tonight and then continuing. So check them out at socratesinthecity.com. I couldn't recommend it more highly. And please join me in thanking Eric for joining us tonight.